Jake Thompson was no stranger to the wilderness. As an avid camper, he had spent countless nights under the stars, deep in the forests far from civilization. This time, he chose the Blackwood Forest, a place known for its isolation and the strange, unsettling stories whispered among locals. Jake didn't care for ghost stories. He wanted peace, solitude, and the quiet embrace of nature. He arrived at the edge of the forest late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking low. The drive had been long, the roads narrow and winding, but the clearing he found was perfect, a small patch of flat ground surrounded by towering pines. He set up his tent quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. As the last light of day faded, Jake built a small fire. The crackling flames were a comfort against the encroaching darkness. He ate his dinner, sipped some coffee from his thermos, and let the peace of the woods wash over him. The sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, were familiar and soothing. But as the night deepened, something felt off. The usual chorus of insects and night birds had gone silent, leaving an unnerving quiet. Jake tried to shake it off, but the silence pressed in on him, heavy and unnatural. He couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He turned in early, the unsettling quiet making him uneasy. Inside his tent, he zipped up the flap and lay down, hoping sleep would come quickly. But the silence was too loud, his mind too alert. Every creak of a branch, every whisper of the wind made his heart race. Then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling outside his tent. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The sound was subtle, like something brushing against the fabric of his tent. He strained to listen, every muscle tense. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Jake slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out into the darkness. His flashlight cut through the night, illuminating the clearing in a narrow beam. At first, he saw nothing, just the dim outline of trees and the dying embers of his fire. But then, at the edge of the light, he saw movement. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the light back at him. They were everywhere, peering out from the trees, low to the ground, high up in the branches, silent, unblinking, and fixed on him. The eyes were wrong, too large, too bright, and set in faces he couldn't quite make out in the shadows. Jake's blood ran cold. He scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest, but the eyes didn't move. They just stared, watching him, waiting. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, but the fear gnawing at his gut told him otherwise. Suddenly, the rustling grew louder, surrounding him. It was as if the forest itself was alive, the trees whispering and shifting in the dark. The eyes began to blink, one by one, in a slow, synchronized pattern that seemed almost like communication, like they were talking to each other. Jake's flashlight flickered, the beam wavering, and then it went out. He cursed under his breath, smacking the flashlight against his palm, but it refused to turn back on. Panic set in as the darkness closed around him. He could still see the eyes, now glowing brighter in the absence of his light. Something moved closer. He heard the soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, and then a low, guttural growl. Jake felt his skin prickle with fear. He grabbed his knife, the only weapon he had, and held it tightly in his trembling hand. The growl came again, this time from right behind him. Jake whipped around, slashing the air with his knife, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive darkness and those damn eyes, watching, waiting. Then, he felt it, hot breath on the back of his neck. Jake spun around, but again, nothing. The eyes were all around him now, closing in, the air thick with the sound of rustling leaves and that terrifying growl. He could feel the presence of something massive, something hungry, just beyond his sight. Without thinking, Jake bolted. He sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at his clothes, roots threatening to trip him. The eyes followed, flitting through the trees, always just out of reach. The growls grew louder, more guttural, more savage, echoing through the woods like a predator closing in on its prey. Jake's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't dare slow down. He could feel them getting closer, their presence oppressive, suffocating. The forest seemed endless, the darkness impenetrable. But just when he thought he couldn't run any further, he saw it, his truck, parked at the edge of the clearing. He sprinted the last few yards, fumbling for his keys as he reached the door. The growls were right behind him now, the eyes visible just beyond the tree-line. Jake yanked the door open, threw himself inside, and slammed it shut. He jammed the key into the ignition, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, tires spinning on the dirt before catching traction. The truck lurched forward, barreling down the narrow road as fast as he could make it go. In the rearview mirror, he saw the eyes watching him from the edge of the woods, a sea of glowing orbs fading into the distance. But even as he sped away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still following, still waiting. He didn't stop driving until he reached the safety of his home. But even then, he couldn't escape the memory of those eyes, the way they had stared into his soul, cold and unfeeling. Jake never went camping again. The wilderness had lost its allure, replaced by a deep, primal fear. He knew that those eyes were out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for their next victim. And he was certain that one day, they would find him again.